Hi again YouTube, it's that one guy from Lit class, and today I'm going to be talking about some basic literary analysis techniques. So right off the bat, let me be clear that we're going to be focusing on three big schools of thought. This video is partly to inform people and to give them a jumping off point into literary theories, but it's also for people who get to an essay prompt and think, I have no idea what to write about. And we're going to look at three approaches you can take to writing that essay. So let's say you've got a book that you want to analyze, or that someone else, like for example your English teacher, wants you to analyze. There are three main sources of information that you can try to use to help you interpret or understand that book, or poem, or play, or essay, or whatever. The first and most obvious source of info is of course the book itself, and the technique of using what the book says to learn about that book is called formalism. Formalism, by definition, is not interested in anything other than what can be found in the text. You can think of formalism as taking an engine apart. The goal is to try and identify how the book or poem or whatever was made, and this is done largely by identifying the literary devices that make it up, like taking the parts off an engine one by one to see how they were put together in the first place, and how they work together as part of a larger system. The literary devices that formalism is interested in are things that you learn about in literature class: symbolism, foreshadowing, grammar, simile and metaphor, direct and indirect characterization, all that sort of thing. In addition, formalism tries to see connections between works, like how older works influence newer ones. Formalism was codified as a set of principles as part of the reaction against Romanticism, which I've talked about in a previous video. But formalist ideas have been around for as long as stories have. One of the earliest examples of a formalist approach, although it wasn't called that at the time, comes to us in Aristotle's Poetics, which I've talked about in a previous video as well. In the Poetics, Aristotle tries to break down plays by examining the specific parts that make them up, similar to the way a formalist might try and break down a novel into its constituent parts. One of the main criticisms of formalism is that it becomes too formulaic, especially in a class setting where the students are only exposed to one type of analysis. The argument is that if all students ever learn to do is boil down a literary work into a collection of tropes and devices, they aren't really thinking critically about the effect of those devices on the work as a whole, or on themselves as readers. In addition, some people argue that formalism takes away from the appreciation of the final product. Not unlike watching how a sausage is made, you might get a better understanding of the inner workings of the process, but it can cause you to feel a little queasy about the end result. The second source of information you can use when analyzing a text is the writer's life and other works. This type of analysis is sometimes called authorial intent. Basically, this school of thought argues that 1. The author had a reason for putting what he or she did in the book, and 2. That discovering these reasons can lead to a more complete and accurate interpretation of that book. Thus, we have critics who look for similarities between the author's life and the life of their main characters. One well-known comparison is author J.D. Salinger and protagonist Holden Caulfield from Salinger's novel The Catcher in the Rye. Many of Holden's life circumstances are ones that Salinger himself went through or was going through, and it's easy to see how one could use that connection as a way into the text, by trying to figure out what the author was saying about his or her own life through their characters. Authorial intent can also include statements the author makes about the work in interviews, especially about why the work was created and what sources the author is knowingly drawing from. The big criticism of authorial intent is one of relevance. Does it matter how much the text runs parallel to the author's life? Are the interpretations that include the author's biographical information the only valid interpretations of that work? As YouTube superstar John Green likes to point out, books belong to their readers, implying that ultimately the author isn't terribly important in how you interpret a book. Whether you agree with the criticism or not, these are the kinds of questions that authorial intent battles against, and if you're planning on using this approach in a criticism of something, you'll need to be aware of them and prepare a response. The last theory we'll be covering today is reader response theory, which stands pretty much in direct opposition to authorial intent. As the name implies, reader response theory is very concerned with how the work's audience reacts to the work. One of the pioneering works of reader response theory is Roland Barthes' 1967 essay, Death of the Author. In the essay, Barthes essentially argues that the author's role in a story is not that of a creator who has sudden inspirations and who writes these new stories, but instead as that of a scripter, which is his word, whose job is not to create anything new, but instead to rearrange already existing story bits into interesting combinations. He further argues that this allows a reader to think of a text as a conveniently grouped collection of language, rather than a story written from on high by an author with a capital A. This, he argues, makes it so that we cannot know what an author intended, and since the author's voice is no longer privileged, the reader's voice is what matters when trying to understand a text. In earlier schools of thought, the author gives the text meaning by creating that text. In reader response, since the author doesn't really matter, the role of meaning creator is given to the reader, who does the literary equivalent of completing a circuit by reading and interpreting a text. This is why the reader's voice is so valued in reader response theory. Three main branches of reader response theory exist today, and they can be quickly summarized as follows. Individualists try to figure out how one person responds to a text. Experimenters try to figure out why people respond to text the way they do, often by having people read a text containing basic literary tropes, the kinds of things a formalist would study, and measuring what responses those kinds of things elicit. And finally, uniformists, who try to figure out what the, quote, standard response to a text is. As different as reader response theory is from authorial intent, the main criticism remains the same, and it is that of relevance. If you buy into reader response theory, you of course think it's relevant how you or any audience responds to a text. But if you don't, that information is basically useless. Furthermore, since reader response privileges the voice of the reader, it opens up more ways of interpreting a text than formalism or authorial intent would. Reader response proponents argue that this is a good thing, that it allows for expression and individual self-discovery, etc. But those opposed say that the slippery slope reader response is skirting around is that all interpretations are equally valid. This is where the whole idea that, quote, in English class you can just make stuff up, unquote, nonsense comes from. People who disagree with reader response theory and often don't really understand it in the first place. To wrap up, I'd like to remind you that this is meant to be a brief overview of these theories. They are more nuanced and subdivided than I have given them credit for here, and if you're interested in learning more, there is a wealth of information on the internet. Hopefully, though, this gives you a good starting point, either for learning more about the world of literary criticism, or just for writing the essay you've been procrastinating on for a month now. Thanks for watching.